The lady has foolishly attempted to join the conversation with a wild and dangerous opinion of her own.
Here's to the ladies, the fair and the weak. Fair they are, we'll all admit, but who dares call them weak? Our modern girls play as hard and with as much vitality and stamina as any man.
The Christian F Word.
A Christian podcast for everyone else. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah and I'm a Christian feminist.
I'm David, I'm a Christian, but I do not like labels.
You're listening to the Christian F Word. Today's episode is episode 8, Racism in the Church. So before we get started, we're going to start with a prayer. Today's prayer is by Robert Browning. The lark's on the wing, the snail's on the thorn. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world.
Amen.
So today we are going to be discussing the topic of race, and this is something that has been going on for quite a while now, this discussion about race and racism in and outside of the church. If you've been on social media, if you've been watching the news, there's been so much racial division in our country and in our communities, in our churches, and this topic is something that definitely needs to be discussed from the egalitarian perspective, but also the Christian perspective, so we can try to find out what to do in our churches, because there's so much hurt and there's so much pain and so much confusion from everybody, and trying to address this topic is important for starting to kind of alleviate some of that suffering and bring Christ into it, so we can heal, we can grow together, and we can minister more effectively to everybody around us. So we're going to start with kind of asking, what is race? And we're going to try to talk about that a little bit. What is race? Is race looks? Is it color? Is it culture? Because our definition of what race is affects how we view other people and how we view ourselves. There's this idea that, we can separate race from culture, or we can just look at skin color and assume someone's culture, someone's identity. And all of this does affect who we are as a person and how we perceive other people. I tend to believe that now we're in the South, we're in Florida, and so I've noticed in the South, there's a lot more racial division and a lot more racism within these communities and these churches that I think is less subtle. However, I also want to acknowledge that I think everybody has their own prejudices and biases. I don't think living in our world today that anybody is free from all biases. I think that we have our own perceptions that we've grown into. We've been taught by our parents, by our surroundings, that we've learned from watching TV as children, or, all of these things affect us whether we recognize it or not. And being able to recognize it and acknowledge it gives us the power over it. So if I'm aware that there may be certain biases based on how I grew up or how I was developed, then I can keep a watch out for that and be more mindful in how I treat others and how I treat this issue. So specifically going with that, David, what do you think the importance is of defining race as far as how we view other people and how we see through our own lens? What is race to us? What is race to others?
Well, I know personally, growing up, race used to be defined as skin color, and because I was actually raised, I guess you could say, within a minor racist household.
Mm-hmm.
I really did not quite understand the difference between race and skin color and cultural issues. But as I've grown, I've noticed that I'm looking at race has nothing to do with the color of someone's skin, but someone's ethnic background, where someone's from and the culture that they have been raised with. And I know that I used to define race also by someone's looks. Yeah, about a little over a year and a half ago, I used to have this job that I worked at where it was a tourist shopping center. So if I were to see someone walk into the store with a head covering and they had the look of a full Muslim look, I would freak out and be scared because I was afraid of things, that would happen, in the store. Like, oh my gosh, is something terrible going to happen here? And I did not realize how wrong that was. I've become here lately, more and more, convicted by these thoughts, and this ain't the way that a Christian should behave.
Yeah, and a lot of times, again, going back to the idea that race is based on your skin color, there are so many different ethnic backgrounds, things like that, the more we choose to educate ourselves on people and get to know people for who they are and not what they are, it becomes apparent to us that a lot of times our initial judgments and thoughts are very ignorant.
Yes.
So, especially with the idea, I'll kind of jump into that a little bit more with what David's talking about, especially with the idea of Middle Eastern or Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that's very prevalent in our church today. There's definitely a black-white issue going on with what's in the media, and I think the more media and news definitely portrays this race, like this racial war. But I think specifically in the church, what I've recognized, especially where I'm at, is that there's a huge bias against Middle Eastern. And I was born up north in Connecticut, and so there was not a lot of racial division as a child for me. I was born best friends with everybody, and they were all immigrants, different nationalities, different religions, different skin colors, and there was nothing that was necessarily wrong about that to me as a child, because we had our street corner, we had the Polish bakery, we had the Italian bakery, we had the Greek bakery, we had the the Middle Eastern store, all these things. And so it was kind of celebrated. Your race was celebrated, your ethnic background, who you were, was celebrated, and it was kind of what was different about you was something that we cherished, and that's why we liked one another, we loved one another, and we were friends. But definitely in the church environment I'm in, and have been in here, has been something different, where it's very, it's a negative thing to have a different kind of culture or different background, because you're looked at as weird or different, and that difference kind of builds a fear in people that there's something wrong with you. Mm-hmm. So the Middle Eastern thing I'm very familiar with, because I am part Syrian. My grandmother was from Syria, so being Middle Eastern in a church setting is very interesting, because my grandmother was an Orthodox Christian. She was Syrian Orthodox, and she would call God Allah. But in the church today, if you were to refer to God as Allah, you would get a lot of backlash, and it would be assumed that, well, you're worshiping Muhammad or a pagan god, because there's not a lot of education, especially in the areas that we function in the South, that it's very prejudiced, it's very biased. So there's a lot of this going on, and so especially with David, he was raised this way, and so he has a lot of experience with that, and nothing against, again, like we talked about last week, it's not the idea of disowning who you were or what you believed in the past. It's the continual progression of growing in your relationship with God. And that's not wrong. And so I think first of all, that dating a Middle Eastern person has changed his perspective a little bit. But it's also, kind of opened his eyes a little bit to the culture, but also theologically we've discussed these things many times, and I think I remember, I'm going to be honest with one of the first conversations me and him actually had about theology was about the word Allah.
It was.
Because he had made a Facebook post about it, and I was like, what the heck are you talking about? You're wrong. That's, my grandmother used that word, and there's nothing wrong with it. So just bringing that into it, the idea that in America, for certain groups of people, not everybody, but there's a certain group that believe that this kind of like white supremacy, in the sense of, we look at Jesus as this white, blonde,
or
auburn-haired French man, right? It's kind of a running joke theologically that, we have Renaissance Jesus who looks nothing like Jesus. If you want to be honest, the chosen race essentially is, you have your Middle Eastern Jews, right? So Jesus, actual Jesus, would probably have a little bit more people uncomfortable in church on Sunday than the Jesus that we look at in pictures, because historically Jesus has been whitewashed to cultures, a lot of the prevalent cultures, especially in Europe and England, we have this depiction of Jesus looking like this, very magnificent king. And what was that for? We painted Jesus as a king so that we allowed people to honor their king as they honor God.
Yes.
And historically, using race to show who God is has been a very dangerous tool that a lot of people have instated to change and manipulate people's opinion of God and how we treat other people based on how our Jesus looks or how our God looks and how we depict in icons and photographs and murals of who Christ is. Racially, we have created a big divide and this false idea that Jesus is a white man, but
he's darker than dark can be.
Exactly. And so this idea that Jesus, and I'm trying to put this in a nice way, but we take away from Christ when we put him into our own culture. Amen. And we put him into our own race.
Amen.
And that doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't understand or God doesn't understand us because, Jesus isn't white. But I think the significance has always been that Christ has loved and been the minority. So even in that time period, the Jews were always a minority. The Jews were always enslaved. They're always going through this. They were a minority to Rome. And in that, I think a lot of minorities and people who have truly suffered and seen that oppression look to Christ and realize that Christ has been there. And so racially, that's very significant. And so, being of different racial backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, these bring a lot of different experiences and perspectives. And none of this is bad. Having different experiences, those should be celebrated because they make us who we are. And even Paul talks a lot about this, about celebrating these differences because they're incredible ministry tools and reaching out to others and loving one another, learning from one another, and being able to be missionaries. But I think a lot of times we take these differences and these different experiences, perspectives, and there's a tendency to be able to say, this experience is my experience and my experience is the best, therefore your experience has no bearing and is wrong. However, that's so dangerous because what we do is we cut off an entire people group based on the idea that our culture is right and theirs is wrong. And we need to stop looking at it in those terms that I'm right and you're wrong. Both of our cultures are beautiful and they should be celebrated. We should not damage them. We should not take from them, and we should not try to one-up one another in that.
Right. Well, there's also, this issue of, like we were discussing earlier, of race not being subjected to skin color, because as everyone knows, you have black people in Africa, black people in Jamaica, black people in Hades. You got black people in the Middle East. We got different types of Asian people, but all over the world.
Yeah, you have you have white Africans, you have white Europeans, you have white Middle Eastern people. So yes, to appropriate an entire culture and a people based on a skin tone is very ignorant, and it's very dangerous. And
that's where I think us here in America, we have a big issue, because that's how we seem to separate the human race, is we separate it off into colors, and then also how we expect people to look, especially coming into the church. Growing up, most of the church services I have been to, everyone has to dress up real nice, right? We all have women in dresses or even pantsuits, men in three-piece suits, or a nice decent casual shirt, and we all come to listen to Southern gospel music or just your average temporary Christian music, and we all expect this is how everyone needs to come to church, and this is how they need to look.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the number one debate in churches today, statistically and just through experience, the number one debate in churches that divides churches today the most is, what type of worship music are we playing?
Oh my God.
I know everybody in any church, you must have had this experience or this conversation with somebody, or overheard this conversation about, well, what kind of music are we going to play? Are we going to play contemporary music, or are we going to play, traditional, because we don't want to scare the older people away, but we also want to draw in the younger crowd? And God forbid that we play anything that's a little too upbeat, like rap music, because then we're really going to scare everybody away. And I've been in these conversations, and I think that if we are lacking in including anybody or anybody's culture or anybody's tendency with music, that we're pushing people away and we're being too self-involved. Because in reality, the style of music shouldn't matter as much as who we're worshiping and how we're worshiping.
Amen.
So, we kind of equate this idea that, in churches today, in my experience, I've heard the statement, and I believe that the statement is for Christians to welcome other cultures and races in. It's the idea of, I'm accepting of your color if you look like my culture. Mm-hmm. The idea of statements like, I like black people and I'm not racist, but I don't like rap music. And statements like that are so offensive because they really diminish a person, a human being, an entire culture, an entire race down to a single statement and a single stereotype of, well, I don't like your type of music. Or I don't like the clothes you wear. So if you don't dress like a gangster, or you don't listen to a certain type of music, then you're allowed in my church, because that's the proper way to worship God. Right. But in reality, that has nothing to do with worshiping God. It has everything to do with how comfortable we are. And we should not tell somebody that their culture is wrong for our own comfort and our comfortability. So, I think it's important to address, things like how we treat other people, not just in our actions, but also our words, how we say things, how we perceive others and what we don't like about others. Why are we downgrading someone because they enjoy rap music? Because I think there's a big difference between rap as an entire style and then lyrics of music, because you have contemporary music that has just god awful lyrics that are so just inappropriate to listen to. So if you're going to say rap music is wrong, but then you're going to listen to other contemporary music that has a pretty bad message, especially another one is country music. A lot of country songs. Yeah, country songs. David, what are country songs about?
My wife cheated on me. I'm gonna drink lots of beer. My dog died. Something really depressing.
Yeah.
And I know that might offend some people that I just said that, but
yeah, well, that's the thing, is a lot of country music has a lot of messages like that, talks about alcohol, things like that. And again, maybe we'll have an alcohol talk another time, but if especially if we're a church that believes that you're not supposed to be drinking alcohol, then how can we agree with a certain, you see what I'm saying? So to take an entire culture, diminish it to a song or a style of music or a style of dress or a style of speaking is very degrading, and it's also it pushes away our mission. It pushes people outside of our churches. And so for churches today who really don't understand this idea of racial division, we look at the issue and it's easy for us to say, well, I'm not racist, or this isn't racist, but we fail to see the subtle racial things that we do to one another that may not seem harmful to us, but that are very harmful to other people. So now I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal experience with this while I was a youth pastor. So in my last church, while I was youth pastoring, a majority of my students were minorities. So being a white pastor over minorities was not just eye-opening for me to see their experiences and what they went through, but it was also eye-opening to me personally to show me a lot of my own ignorance and how I viewed things and how I assumed things to be for them. So the number one thing that I learned, I actually wrote an article through Christians for Biblical Equality about this, about sexism and racism in the church with youth in particular. And so the main thing that I learned through this is that racism is not always blatant. And in fact, it is rarely ever just something someone says. It's always this subtle kind of things that happen not just outside of the church but within the church. So it was much more prevalent outside of our church. I will say that was a much more bold-faced racism that we experienced outside of the church. especially for youth events, when we were doing fundraisers, when we were going to camps, things like that, youth events, say, we went to Rock the Universe. If you don't know what Rock the Universe is, it's a big Christian music festival at Universal Studios in Orlando, and they have it all around the country in different places, but several in the Central Florida area. We went there, and there was just this big backlash based on their race outside of the church community. So there were so many different instances where they would be looked at, and I would be looked at, and you can clearly see somebody's judging just based on the fact of, who is this white girl with all of these black children? And there's always those questions and like, who are these kids? Are you okay? Why are you with all this group of students? And it was always, we would always laugh at it as a group. But in fact, it's kind of sad to see where our society still is. I remember doing a car wash one time. We were on the side of the road holding signs, and we had several cars pass by blurting out racial slurs and very inappropriate language towards my students in a very derogatory fashion. And for me, as their pastor, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? How do I respond to this? How do I handle this? Do I console them? Do I tell, do we have a conversation about this? And, the funny thing is they would look at me and they would laugh, and they'd say, Pastor Sarah, why are you so surprised about this? This is nothing, and they were more amused at the fact that I was uncomfortable with it, and I was upset that people had said that to them. And they said, trust me, you don't know half of what said does. This is just normal. It's funny, you just yell back at them. That's what they were used to. And so I think the ignorance of not allowing myself to be in that place, or to assume how they would respond, or assume how I should respond, or not knowing how to respond, those are all different things that you're not really prepared for. And I believe our churches today don't really help prepare you for that, because our actions matter just as much as our words. And so this is outside of the church, but then within the church, we experience the same sort of things. Our youth, we would have things said to them, and I would just roll my eyes and say, how could you say that to one of our students? Or how could you say something, to someone of, so terrible or so inappropriate? But to them, they may not have realized that it was even wrong. So being careful that, not only are we being, understanding what we're saying, and always think before we speak. I think that's the biggest word of advice in these situations, is think before we speak, but also watch our actions. Are we treating certain people differently based on their skin color? And I think that's an important way for us to understand that. So, David, in your experience, what are some ways that you've seen this handled within the church? How often to you has race been really addressed as an issue? Because I feel like a lot of times, especially with what's going on in the media, with the idea of the Black Lives Matter movement, things like that, I feel like the church has a tendency with everything else, to just kind of throw these issues under the rug and just say, it's not an issue, slavery's gone, why do we care anymore? So, how have these issues in your experience been addressed, and why do you think that it's been that way?
Well, personally, I can honestly say that within youth, you would have like some white boys actually dressed up as what, quote, they would call it as a black person would dress, unquote. And you would actually have like grown people in the church say, why are you dressing like a black boy for? Or why are you dressing, and and it's just, little stupid stuff like that,
Exactly, and it's just essentially
a stereotypical,
and degrading someone to just what they wear, right?
Exactly, and because I'll be honest with you, most churches that I've been to really didn't have a lot of black people in it. You might have maybe one, but they would either be more Hispanic, maybe, but more white than anything.
Exactly.
And now I have gone to all black churches, and I'll be honest, I have felt more accepted and more comfortable there than even amongst my own.
Exactly, and definitely, and in a lot of the experiences that we've both had, this is kind of the case again in this southern setting that we're in, where racism does tend to have a foothold. So anybody different, racially, ethnically, walking into that situation is immediately felt uncomfortable because eyes are already on them, judging them, and people can feel that. And I've experienced what that can bring. So the idea that our churches are kind of more like this melting pot, you have to assimilate to us as Christians in order to be accepted by Christians. So, especially with going back to the Middle Eastern issue, the idea of, if a woman comes in with a head covering, are we going to judge her more than if somebody, a beautiful blonde woman walks in with her family and her kids? Are we going to accept her more than the one wearing the head covering? And the thing is, I think sadly the answer is probably yes. And that's not a very Christian thing to say, but it's a very realistic thing to say. That our churches today are very biased in how we treat people. And so we have these two extremes. We have the extreme of assimilation, which is drop everything about you, become an American Christian, and you'll be fine. You'll fit in with everybody else. You can join Bible studies, you can go to VBS, all this stuff, as long as you look like us. And then, with that comes kind of this extreme of the idea of being blind to color, being blind to race, and saying, well, I don't see color, I don't see race, none of that stuff matters to me. But I also think that that's a very ignorant statement, because when we say we're blind to color, we also become blind to people's experiences, and we become blind to the culture that they have and the experiences that they have that cannot hurt us but enrich us. And we need to get rid of this fear that someone else's culture or race is going to take away from our own, because that's not true at all. And in fact, the church, the early church that Paul is functioning within, he's suggesting that other races and other cultures can enrich our Christian experience and our churches, and it should be diverse and different. So, Paul talks about this idea in 1 Corinthians 9 of, being a Jew to the Jews, and I'll read you the text because I think it's very important when we discuss race, is starting in 1 Corinthians 9:19 is, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many people as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like those under the law, though I am myself not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And what Paul's talking about here is he's discussing the idea of us not expecting people to assimilate to us, but us assimilating to other people. Yeah. And what that means is we are supposed to be good hosts. We are supposed to be good, hospitable guest bringers, right? And so when somebody comes into our church, it is not our responsibility to expect them to stop looking like who they are, but it is our responsibility to welcome them, make them feel comfortable, and to celebrate their culture, to celebrate who they are, and to tell them that that's okay. And Christ wants that, and we want that. We don't want them to change. They don't need to change. And, this idea of changing who you are is very ignorant, and telling somebody, be different because, we want you to look like us.
Right. Well, that's something that I actually have seen done so many times. Coming to church, even in myself, and I'll be honest, like when I came to church looking like a mess, or at least what they were considered looking like a mess. They said, well, that's okay, David, because after Jesus cleans you on the inside, he's going to clean you on the outside too. Therefore, you would no longer look like you look now, but you would be somebody else. But I do not think that that's what God calls a Christian to be, because a Hindu that comes to Christ, in India, is going to still look like themselves, as the same way as somebody in Africa, or somebody in Israel, or somebody in Pakistan, or somebody from any of the Islamic countries, because their culture doesn't change just because they come to Jesus Christ.
And it shouldn't. Exactly.
And I think that is just a real ignorant thing to say to somebody, because Christ does not call you to him to change who you are, but he calls to enhance who you are, but through him.
Exactly.
And I think that's just a a terrible thing to do to somebody, because they're saying, well, what, am I not good enough? I mean, Jesus says, he says, come as you are. Then people say, well, but that doesn't mean change, it will stay how you are. But, yeah, I mean, the things that God wants taken care of is on the inside, and he will change that kind of.
Exactly, and it has nothing to do with the outside. And we talk about this, we discuss this in our Myth of Modesty episodes, and we talk about the idea that modesty has nothing to do with your appearance. It has everything to do with your inner characteristics. In the same way, we look at verses like, my favorite verse is Galatians 3:28, which says, there is no slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female, because we are one in Christ Jesus. And so the idea that there is no race because we are one race, we are the race of God. But in the, all of this going into kind of the modern issue of racial division in the church, we're going to address that a little bit. So especially with this Black Lives Matter movement, people in the church have kind of responded, I think, majority with all lives matter, right? We are all one in Christ Jesus, therefore there is no race in God. And that is that statement essentially just washes us of guilt. That's what it is. It's the idea of, I don't have to look at race. I don't have to look at the Black movement. I don't have to look at the Black pain because all lives matter, so I'm not going to address yours. And, there's a huge debate, and the idea that we ignore the issue because we don't want to give someone or a certain race too much attention is a little unfair. Actually, it's not a little, it's quite unfair, because I've heard again the argument that if one house is on fire in a neighborhood, you don't spray every single house with water. You take care of the one that's on fire. So if there is an issue and there is a pain and there is something going on there, we have to, as a church, address that, and we have to be mindful to it, and we have to be sensitive to it, because these are all things that Christ tells us to do, to be sensitive to the needs of others. And we have to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice. So if there is a pain, if there is a suffering in our church with a particular group of people, we have to recognize that and acknowledge it as legitimate. It's a lot like the Me Too movement, or the idea of, abuse victims coming forward in the church. To ignore the issue is to ignore the pain of people who are trying to cry out to God's church. And it's inappropriate to say that, well, we can't address the issue too much because, we don't want to spend too much time on it. And that just keeps making the issue worse and worse, because we have been dealing with these issues since the beginning of the church. And we still, for some reason, after these thousands of years, we still have not gotten it right. And we continue to argue over the same things and ignore the same issues. And we're not getting any better. We're not getting any smarter, because we're choosing to ignore it. We're choosing to pretend that, well, all lives matter, so we can't focus on Black lives. But it's not about focusing on one and ignoring the other. The issue of racial equality does not mean everybody has to be on a level playing field as far as how we're treated and how we feel like our pain is being handled. Dealing with the issue of racial equality or racial inequality, it demands certain things to be dealt with in different ways. So if there's a pain that needs to be dealt with, if there is an issue that is brought up, we can't ignore it and say, well, there's no, nobody's racist. Racism doesn't exist. Or, slavery was so long ago, nobody is affected by it today. Those are very ignorant statements, because there hasn't been a day in the United States where slavery has not been an issue. We have issues like human trafficking, but we can then say human trafficking is an issue, but then we can also say, well, slavery doesn't exist, which isn't true. So, all of this to go into, we're going to talk about some biblical stories in a second about race and how Christ handled race. But I think from a practical standpoint, as a church, we really need to start figuring out, how do we treat others, but also how do we reflect on ourselves and say, how can we look at ourselves and figure out do we have prejudice? What are we doing that we could do better? Because that's, I think, what needs to start happening in all of us. How can we look at ourselves and see, what can we do better? Because we can all improve on everything. We can always progress. We can always go further. So we can look at and evaluate the places in our life where we do need to, as a church, move forward. How can we improve? How can we, do that? So David, for you, with this modern movement and this idea of, Black Lives Matter, how do you feel that the church is responding to that?
Well, pretty much how I think the church responds to almost everything. They find some kind of way to
blame everyone else.
Blaming everybody else, whether it's the mainstream media, or that they will, they'll do what they normally do. They'll turn toward, and please forgive me if this offends anybody, they'll turn to Israel. Well, what about Israel? And granted, there is a lot of things that go on over there. There's a lot of things that go on everywhere. The world is hurting. Mm-hmm. But, if we can't settle what's going on within this country right here, right now, and within our own churches, how can we go out and save the world? Because it has to start somewhere, and there is a lot of damage going on here right now. There was somebody that I talked to, who drives a truck where I work, and he was talking about here in the South, because he's from up north. But he says here in the South, he says he has never seen such division in race until he came here. He says most states, because he drives all over the country, but he says there's not like one place that he can walk into, even in a church, where he feels comfortable. Mm-hmm. He says if it wasn't for him knowing who he was as a person, he said he would be devastated and terribly affected. But he says he knows he's a good person. He knows he's accepted by God. And if it wasn't for that, he says he don't know how he would be able to handle this. Mm. And I told him, all I could do was, sir, I'm sorry, and I apologize, and I broke down with him in a way, and I was able to sit there and talk to him and kind of encourage him, and says, I understand, I see this too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And to me, one of my favorite stories, going back to Genesis, the idea of Abraham and Sarah and their relationship with Hagar. So, you have Abraham and Sarah, the story, they bring Hagar in, and that was really not a good choice. They decided to go against God. They bring Hagar, the Egyptian, in. And long story short, Hagar and her son Ishmael are sent off into the desert. And we always look at Sarah and Abraham. They're patriarchs. They're the heroes. They went out. But Hagar's cast out. Her and her son are cast out into the desert. They're Egyptians. They're outsiders. There's definitely some racial issues going on here, but also issues of gender. There are issues of, birthright. There are issues of, slavery. All of these things going on. And Hagar goes out into the desert, and she essentially just prays for death at this point. She just prays for God to just end it, And Christ appears to her, not just God, but Christ appears to her and says, essentially, why are you crying? Why are you upset? Don't you know that I'm going to take care of you? And the amazing part of that story to me is that in all of this, God has always comforted the minority. God has always comforted those who are outcast, those who are not accepted with society, and therefore that is who we should, as a church, strive to go towards and see where we can bring God's blessing to. And so I've always loved, again, Hagar, the idea that regardless of her being a Gentile, God still pursued her in the desert, appeared to her, and answered her prayers. Mm-hmm. So even in the Old Testament, even when we have this huge Gentile divide, God is still pursuing the Gentile those of a different race, those who don't fit in, those who are ostracized, those who can't attain that relationship with God. That's an idea, but God was just as present with her then as God is present with her now, as in the people who don't fit in. Those who are like Hagar, those who are in the desert wandering, those who don't fit in churches, things like that. Christ is just as present with them. And so it's important to note that when we talk about race, I think that the idea that as much pain as we have in the church, there's so much work we need to do. But for those of us who feel like we can't fit in for whatever reason, Christ is still present with us. He's still blessing with us. He's answering our prayers, and he's walking through the deserts with us. So I think that's really important, talking about racial division.
Exactly. That's just like the Good Samaritan, a parable that Jesus talks about. As you know, the Samaritans, according to the Jews, were lower than dogs in their eyes. They were treated like, complete garbage. But when Jesus was asked, how do you love your neighbor? He kind of brought up the Good Samaritan. When there's a man that was robbed, he was a Jewish man. He was beaten and robbed and tossed into the ditch, pretty much, left there to die. And as he's laying there, barely hanging on to his life, you have a priest walk by, and as he's reaching up for the priest just continues walking on, leaving his fellow brother left there to die. Later on, a Pharisee walks by, and again continues on about his business, until a Samaritan man walks up, sees the dude lying there, barely hanging on to his life, doctors him up, gives him water, nurses him, puts him on his donkey, and walks him to the nearest inn, pays his way to stay there, tells him to feed him, take good care of him, gives him money left over, and he says, "I'll come back and pay more if I have to." That is somebody that was looked to as a dog. Who knows how that Jewish man laying there in the ditch would have treated him on a different circumstance.
Exactly.
But that guy was there for him.
Yeah, and so I think all of this to say, how do we address race in the church and racism in our churches? Because it's there, whether we want to recognize it or not. But if we recognize our own faults and our own prejudices, then we have power over it, and it doesn't control us or come out in unhealthy ways that hurt other people. And to address it properly is to recognize race in a very positive and inclusive way. So not saying that we're blind to color or that race doesn't exist, that we're all one in Christ. And what that means is, it doesn't mean that you have to lose everything you have and assimilate to our culture. What that means is that your culture included. So bring who you are, your race, your culture, your ethnicity, everything about you, bring in, and we're going to fit it in together. And have healthy environments for people who are different from us to thrive. So regardless of who they are, whether they're a Jew or a Greek or a Muslim or, some Middle Eastern person with a head covering that makes us uncomfortable, whether it is a black or a white or Hispanic, have ways that other people can engage their culture in your church, in your community. Make these people comfortable, because Paul says that we have to reach out to them. And that is the most effective missionary tactic, whether you are a missionary in your church or if you're a missionary overseas. You don't go to a mission in another country and hand them a Bible, say, learn English, read it in English, act like an American, be patriotic, worship the American flag, and dress like me. Exactly. That's not how we do mission work. We go there and we present the gospel to them in ways that they can understand and that they can adapt to and learn from, and then utilize in their own cultures. We can't change their culture and expect that Christianity is to look American. And we're going to do this in another podcast, the idea of American Christianity and how dangerous it can be to be overly patriotic, and how that can damage our witness. But being able to show people that we may think are different than us, that they're welcome with us, and that they have a place with us, and that they're included, and they can bring who they are and what they are and the things that they have traditionally been given by their cultures, their ethnicities. Celebrate that as a group, as a community. That's the healthiest way to start solving these issues. Now, there's so much racial divide in our country and our world today that it may not solve everything. However, I know that our God is powerful enough to start there, and it always starts with love. And love is including others and bringing them to our table and allowing them to sit there and not have to change to be there. So I encourage you guys to try to find some effective ways to address this in your churches, because the best way to do this is by discussing, by including people who are different and understanding that no one's perfect and no one's expecting us to be perfect, but we have to at least try, because sitting there saying that there's no issue of race or there's no issue with us as Christians, or, you know, because I am a avid supporter of a lot of these movements of racial equality and gender equality. However, I still continually reflect, how am I doing this? What am I doing wrong, and what can I do better? Yeah. And that's how I'm continually improving. So I appreciate you guys listening to this. We encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. Leave us a review on iTunes and Google Play, because we love to know what you guys think of our podcast, as well as, you know, some content you may want to see from us. We're always open to suggestions, so feel free to email at us at tcfw@thirdwaychurch.com. You can go to our website, christianfword.com, and you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.